let us have an overview of New Economic Policy 1991. Hello everyone, I'm Dr. Mamta Rajani. Presenting over you an overview of New Economic Policy 1991. The year 1991 is one of the most significant one in the economic history of India. The economy underwent some major shifts in its policies and functionings. Now, what was the rationale behind New Economic Policy 1991? Let us have an overlook. Now, what was the rationale behind New Economic Policy 1991? In 1990-91, India faced economic crisis, and because of this crisis, it has led to certain implementation and reasons for implementation of the new economic policy. The first reason was fiscal crisis, that is fiscal imbalances. The fiscal situation in India had been under mounting pressure, especially since 1980s due to widening gap between the revenue and expenditure of the government. The long-term trend in the government finances indicated that the revenue generation had been lower than the expenditure requirements, leading to rising fiscal deficit. High fiscal deficits in the 1980s were one of the root causes of the crisis of 1991. Therefore, reducing the fiscal deficit was an important macroeconomic objective of the new economic policy. Second reason before the implementation of the new economic policy was balance of payment crisis. The Gulf crisis of 1990 led to an unprecedented crisis in the balance of payment. The balance of payment crisis reached its peak in 1991 when the foreign exchange reserves had fallen to about $1 billion. India's access to commercial borrowings from abroad totally dried up as the credit rating agencies downgraded India. At the same time, there was also an outflow of non-resident Indian deposits. A current account deficit of $9.7 billion in 1991 became almost impossible to finance. This leads to severe trade disruption, which in turn forces severe and prolonged import reduction and leads to shortages, industrial dislocation, severe unemployment and high inflation. All these became a possibility of the Indian economy. So this was the second rationale behind new economic policy, that is to overcome the balance of payment crisis. Third reason was high inflationary pressures. The wholesale prices in India rose at an average annual rate of 8.2% during the period 1981-82 to 1993-94. In 1990-91, the rate of inflation crossed double-digit mark and stood at 10.2%. This high rise in price was due to raising of administered prices, especially the prices of petroleum products and indirect taxes on commodities and services. The average rate of inflation was quite high, between 10% to 14% till 1994-95. Now, what were the important policy changes in New Economic Policy 1991? The new government under the Prime Ministership of P.V. Narasimha Rao which assumed office in June 1991, took the following policy measures. The policies are popularly termed as LPG policies, that is the liberalization, privatization and globalization. First, we will have an overlook on macroeconomic stabilization. These measures are short-term measures and aimed at demand management to return to low and stable inflation and a sustainable fiscal and balance of payment position. Now, these measures consisted of control of inflation. Now, what is this control of inflation? How the inflation was controlled? A combination of policies such as fiscal and monetary policies were undertaken to bring down the high inflation rate. Fiscal deficit was brought down from 7.7% of the GDP in 1990-91 to 4.9% in 95-96. This was done by following tight monetary policy which aimed at making borrowing costlier by raising bank rate, CRR and SLR. It was done to reduce money supply and control inflation. Thus, because of these measures, the inflation rate was brought down to 8% in 1995-96 and further to 4.6% in 1996-97. Second measure was fiscal correction. Fiscal reforms were introduced since 1991 to correct the growing fiscal imbalance. Under this, government introduced expenditure reforms to reduce non-productive public expenditure by cutting down subsidies, defense expenditures and administrative expenditures. Government also reduced the budgetary support to public enterprises, and measures were also undertaken to increase tax revenue through tax reforms. Taxes were rationalized and simplified. Third measure was balance of payments adjustment, that is improvement in balance of payments position. Measures were undertaken to improve the balance of payments of the country. The rupee was devalued by 18 to 19% in July 1991. Efforts were made to increase exports. In order to bring about technological upgradation in the export sector, imports were liberalized. Non-debt creating foreign inflows were encouraged in the form of foreign direct investment and portfolio investment into country. Above measures have helped to improve the balance of payments position in the country. Another measures, that is the reforms, were structural reforms. We have seen the macroeconomic stabilization reforms. Now we will see the structural reforms. Structural reforms are long-term measures taken to improve the supply side of the economy. That's why they are termed as supply side management. They are aimed at removing the bottlenecks and obstacles in the growth path of the economy. What were the measures undertaken under structural reforms? First was industrial reforms, public sector reforms, trade and capital flows reforms, financial sector reforms. Are the measures undertaken under industrial sector reforms. First was the abolition of industrial licensing. The new policy abolished industrial licensing for all industries except 18 industries. Whereas at present there are only 3 industries under compulsory licensing. Second reform was permitted foreign investment and technology. The new economic policy encouraged foreign direct investment and foreign technology imports in high priority industries. The number of industries eligible for foreign direct investment has been expanded. FDI was allowed to 51%. Later on, that is subsequently, this limit was raised to 100% for many industries. Third reform was related to reduced role of public sector. The new policy reduced the number of industries reserved for public sector. The industries that were reserved for public sector were reduced from 17 to 3 at present. And another measure taken was the removal of MRTP limit. Under the MRTP Act, large companies with assets of 100 crores and above were not allowed to expand their activities without the government permission. This has resulted in restricting the growth, expansion, and efficiency of such firms. This new policy removed this threshold limit. Now they don't have to take the prior approval of the government for large industrial houses for expansion, establishment of new undertakings, mergers, takeovers, and amalgamation. MRTP Act is now replaced by Competition Act 2002. Now let us have a look on financial sector reforms. The financial sector reforms that were introduced by the government since early 1990s are aimed to make the Indian financial sector strong and transparent. Under this, first in 1992, banking sector reforms were initiated, which were based on the recommendation of Narasimhan Committee. The important reforms introduced in the banking sector since 1991 are lowering of cash reserve ratio, that is CRR, lowering of SLR, that is statutory liquidity ratio, deregulation of interest rates. Scheduled commercial banks have been now given the freedom to set interest rates on their deposits subject to minimum floor rates and maximum ceiling rates. This has resulted in bringing healthy competition among the banks and encouraging their operational efficiency. There was also introduction of capital adequacy norms. The nationalized commercial banks were also allowed to access capital market for funds through public issues. There was also government has permitted the entry of new private sector banks, which has resulted in competition in the public sector banks. The government has also set up special recovery tribunals to facilitate quicker recovery of loan errors. Now just we can see what were the reforms introduced in insurance sector. Insurance sector was the monopoly of the government until recently. Reforms in the insurance sector commenced with the passing of IRDA Act, that is Insurance Regulatory and Development Act of 1999. IRDA Act ended the monopoly of the government in the insurance sector. This is done by encouraging private investment in the insurance sector. The government has also raised the equity investment capital in Indian. Okay, now we will see what are the capital market reforms introduced under New Economic Policy 1999. First was establishment of SEBI, setup of SEBI in 1988, which was made a statutory body in January 1992. SEBI was authorized to regulate all merchant banks on issue activity, lay guidelines, and supervise and regulate the working of mutual funds, and also oversee the working of stock exchanges in India. Companies raising capital in the primary market now are required to disclose all information under primary market reforms. Companies are also allowed to determine the par value of the shares issued by them. Strict norms have been introduced in IPOs. SEBI has also introduced online trading and dematerialized trading. This has led to reduction in time and cost and elimination of various risks associated with paper-based or physical settlement. SEBI has also introduced rolling settlements from January 2000. Under this system, the trading cycles has been shortened and trades are settled within 2 working days. SEBI has also allowed foreign institutional investors to invest in all types of securities traded in the primary and secondary market. SEBI has also introduced investor protection, that is, measures have been taken for the investor protection. For this purpose, Investor Education and Protection Fund has been established in October 2001. SEBI has also come up with setting up of National Securities Clearing Corporation in 1996. It guarantees all trades on National Stock Exchange. Thus, every trade that takes place is freed from the risk of the counterparty defaulting. Now let us see what are the trade and capital sector reforms introduced in new economic policy. The government took the following reforms in the external sector to open up the Indian economy to foreign competition and foreign investment. First was liberalization of imports. Import controls were virtually abolished except for some consumer goods. There was a reduction in tariff structure. The peak import duty on non-agriculture products was reduced from more than 300% to 150% in 1991-92, which has now substantially reduced further to 10% in 2007-8. There was also promotion of exports. For promotion of exports, various incentives were provided to exporters in the foreign trade policies of the government. The exchange rate was allowed to determine by demand and supply in the foreign exchange market since 1993. That is, there was a change in exchange rate policy. This would help to ease the balance of payments problem. SEBI has also introduced, that is, government has liberalized capital inflows in the form of FDI and portfolio investment. Foreign portfolio investors are allowed to invest in all types of securities traded in the primary and secondary markets. Thus, we can see that these were all the reforms which has been introduced under new economic policy. The new economic policy has created an encouraging environment for investment and innovation. Indian industries have started to attract foreign portfolio investments and equity participation in new ventures. India has started to experience higher growth rates in the post-reform period. So Indian economy is now much more integrated with the world economy. Thank you all for wonderful listening.